The silent epidemic. Picture a typical morning in London. The alarm rings at 6:30 a.m. Someone reaches over, silences it, and stares at the ceiling. There's no dread, exactly. But there's no anticipation either. Just flatness. They scroll through their phone, messages, news, social media, looking for something, anything, that might spark a feeling. Nothing does. This person has a decent job. Supportive friends. A comfortable flat in Islington. From the outside, everything looks fine. But inside, there's a numbness that's become so familiar they've almost stopped noticing it. Almost. If this sounds familiar, you're not alone. Across the UK and beyond, millions of people are experiencing something psychologists are increasingly concerned about, a profound loss of joy that isn't quite depression, but isn't quite living either. You still function. You still work, eat, sleep, socialize. But somewhere along the way, the things that used to light you up, that Saturday morning coffee ritual, that favorite album, that hobby you once loved, they've all become muted. Like someone turned down the volume on your emotional life and you can't find the dial to turn it back up. Carl Rogers, one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, understood this phenomenon deeply. Though he never used the modern term anhedonia, his work on the human personality provides perhaps the most compelling explanation for why so many of us feel this way. The question isn't just academic. It's urgent and personal. Because when nothing brings you joy anymore, you're not just missing out on pleasure, you're disconnected from yourself. And according to Rogers, that disconnection is at the root of most psychological suffering. In his decades of clinical work, Rogers observed something remarkable. People don't lose their capacity for joy because they're broken or defective. They lose it because they've become strangers to themselves. They've spent so long being who they thought they should be that they've forgotten who they actually are. But before we can understand Rogers' solution, we need to understand his revolutionary view of human nature, a view that turned traditional psychology on its head and offers surprising insights into why your life might feel so joyless right now. Rogers' revolutionary insight. In the 1940s and 50s, when Carl Rogers was developing his theories, psychology was dominated by two perspectives. On one side was Freud's psychoanalysis, which saw humans as fundamentally driven by unconscious urges and childhood traumas. On the other was behaviorism, which viewed people as essentially programmable, shaped entirely by rewards and punishments. Rogers rejected both. Working with clients in his practice in Chicago and later at the University of Wisconsin, he came to a radically different conclusion: humans aren't driven primarily by base instincts or external conditioning. We're driven by an inherent tendency toward growth, toward becoming more fully ourselves. He called this the actualizing tendency. Think of it like this: plant a seed in decent soil with adequate sunlight and water, and it will grow. It doesn't need instructions. It doesn't need motivation. Growth is what it does naturally. According to Rogers, humans are the same. We have an innate drive to develop our capacities, to become more complex, more aware, more fully realized versions of ourselves. This wasn't naive optimism. Rogers saw plenty of human suffering in his clinical work. But he noticed something crucial: when people struggled psychologically, it wasn't because they lacked this growth tendency. It was because something was blocking it. Imagine trying to grow that seed in darkness or in soil contaminated with toxins. The seed still wants to grow, that's its nature, but the environment prevents it. The result? Stunted, distorted growth. Or sometimes, no visible growth at all, even though the life force is still there, struggling beneath the surface. For Rogers, joylessness was exactly this: not an absence of life force, but a blockage of it. The actualizing tendency is still there in you, still pushing toward growth and aliveness. But something is in the way. This is why the loss of joy feels so frustrating. Deep down, you know something's wrong. You can sense there's more to life than what you're experiencing. That frustration, that vague dissatisfaction, is actually your actualizing tendency trying to get your attention. It's the part of you that knows you're not living in alignment with who you really are. So the question becomes, what exactly is blocking your actualizing tendency? What's standing between you and the capacity for joy that Rogers believed was your birthright? The answer, Rogers discovered, has everything to do with a concept he called conditions of worth, and understanding this concept might be the most important thing you learn about yourself today. The price of approval. Picture a 6-year-old child in a home in Manchester. She's drawing, completely absorbed, tongue slightly out in concentration. She's mixing colors that shouldn't go together, creating something wild and uniquely hers. She feels completely alive. Her father walks in. "That's lovely, darling," he says. Then, seeing her school report on the table, "But I noticed you got a C in maths. We need to spend less time on drawing and more time on homework if you want to make us proud." The child looks at her drawing. Something shifts. The joy she felt moments ago starts to feel wrong. Childish. Unimportant. This moment, repeated thousands of times in thousands of variations, is what Rogers called the development of conditions of worth. The child learns, "I am valuable when I meet certain conditions. I am lovable when I perform in specific ways." Rogers wasn't blaming parents. Most parents genuinely want the best for their children. But here's what happens. Children have a fundamental need for what Rogers called positive regard, acceptance, love, approval. This need is so powerful that children will shape themselves to meet whatever conditions seem to guarantee that regard. I am worthy when I achieve academically. I am lovable when I'm helpful and never needy. I am acceptable when I'm strong and never show weakness. I am valuable when I make others happy. Each condition of worth creates a split. There's who you genuinely are, your organismic self, in Rogers' language, and who you've learned you must be to receive love and approval. Rogers called this second self your self-concept. At first, the gap might be small. But over years, over decades, the self-concept can become so far removed from the organismic self that you barely recognize your own genuine feelings anymore. Think about it. How many times have you said "I'm fine" when you weren't? How often have you pursued a career path that looked good but felt empty? How frequently have you suppressed your real opinion to keep the peace? Each time, you reinforce the conditions of worth. Each time, you move further from your authentic self. Rogers called the gap between your true self and your self-concept incongruence. And here's the crucial insight: incongruence is exhausting. Imagine walking around all day holding your arm at an unnatural angle. At first, you might not notice. But eventually, every muscle in your body would ache from the compensation. That's what psychological incongruence feels like. You're constantly monitoring yourself, editing your responses, performing a version of yourself that you think will be acceptable. And joy? Joy requires presence. It requires being fully in the moment, fully in your body, fully yourself. But when you're busy performing, when you're constantly checking whether your current self matches the self you think you should be, presence becomes impossible. You're at dinner with friends, but part of you is monitoring, am I being interesting enough? Are they judging me? Should I have ordered something different? You're on holiday, but you're thinking, should I be relaxing more efficiently? Am I appreciating this correctly? Even pleasure becomes performance. Especially in the age of social media. A woman in Bristol spends Saturday hiking in the Cotswolds, something she used to love. She's surrounded by beautiful rolling hills, but she's thinking about how the photos will look on Instagram, whether her friends will think she's outdoorsy enough, whether this activity aligns with the personal brand she's been cultivating. By the time she gets home, she's exhausted. She's hiked 5 miles but hasn't actually been present for any of it. This is the exhaustion of incongruence. And it's killing your joy. But Rogers went deeper. He didn't just identify the problem, he identified exactly what happens inside us when we abandon our true selves for the sake of approval. And understanding this process is crucial to finding your way back. The organismic valuing process. Think back to that child drawing. Before her father's comment, how did she know she enjoyed drawing? She didn't read an article about it. She didn't check whether it was approved. She just felt it. There was a direct, immediate sense of yes, this is good. This is right for me. Rogers called this the organismic valuing process, your inborn ability to sense what's genuinely nourishing for you and what isn't. It's remarkably simple when you watch children who haven't yet learned to override it. They're hungry, they eat. They're tired, they sleep. They're curious, they explore. They like certain people and not others, certain activities and not others, and they know this with absolute certainty, not through logic, but through felt sense. This isn't about hedonism or selfishness. It's about an intuitive wisdom that operates below the level of conscious thought. Your organism, your whole being, is constantly processing information and providing feedback. This feels right. This feels wrong. This is nourishing. This is depleting. But here's what happens as we develop conditions of worth. We learn to override the organismic valuing process. We learn to distrust it. You feel exhausted and want to rest, but you tell yourself you should be more productive. You feel uneasy about a relationship, but you silence that feeling because the person looks good on paper. You don't enjoy your career, but you continue because you've invested years and everyone says you're successful. Over time, you stop even hearing the signals. It's like living in a city for so long that you stop noticing the traffic noise, except in this case, what you've stopped noticing is your own inner voice. A man in Edinburgh sits at his desk at a consulting firm. It's 4 p.m. on a Wednesday. His body is sending clear signals: fatigue, restlessness, a vague sense of meaninglessness. But he's learned to ignore these. He drinks another coffee, forces himself to focus, and powers through. This is what responsible adults do. Meanwhile, his organismic valuing process is trying to tell him something important. This work doesn't align with your values. This environment depletes rather than energizes you. You're moving further from who you actually are. But he can't hear it anymore. The voice is too faint, drowned out by years of shoulds. Here's Rogers' crucial insight: when we lose touch with our organismic valuing process, we don't stop valuing things. Instead, we substitute external standards for internal ones. We start asking, what do successful people do? What would my parents approve of? What looks impressive? What will prevent criticism? These become our new criteria for decision-making. And the tragic part? They work, sort of. You can build a life based on these external standards. You can achieve things. You can look successful. You can even feel proud sometimes. But you cannot feel joy. Because joy isn't something you achieve or earn or decide to feel. Joy emerges naturally when you're congruent, when there's alignment between who you are and how you're living. When your choices flow from your organismic valuing process rather than from conditions of worth. Think about the last time you felt genuine, spontaneous joy. Not pleasure you scheduled or optimized, but real, unforced aliveness. Chances are, you weren't monitoring yourself. You weren't performing. You were just being yourself, fully present. That state? That's what Rogers called fully functioning. And it's not some mystical achievement. It's simply what happens when you stop blocking your own nature. Here's the paradox that Rogers observed: the more you chase happiness according to external standards, the more elusive it becomes. You achieve the promotion, buy the house, reach the goal, and feel nothing. Or worse, you feel hollow. Because achievements can bring satisfaction, pride, relief. But they can't bring joy unless they emerge from genuine alignment with your organismic self. So how did we get so disconnected? And more importantly, in a world that constantly demands we be someone other than who we are, is it even possible to reconnect? Rogers spent decades exploring these questions, and what he discovered might surprise you. The locus of evaluation, 5 to 6 minutos. Imagine two people at the same art exhibition in the Tate Modern. The first person walks through, carefully reading every placard, trying to understand what they're supposed to appreciate. They check their phone. What do critics say about this artist? They glance at other visitors, trying to gauge the appropriate reaction. By the end, they feel anxious and inadequate. Did they get it? Did they respond correctly? The second person walks through more slowly. They stop when something catches their eye. They don't stop when it doesn't. They spend 15 minutes with one painting and 5 seconds with another. They don't care what it means or whether their response is correct. They simply notice what moves them. Same exhibition. Radically different experiences. Rogers identified this difference as the locus of evaluation, where you locate the authority to judge your own experience. With an external locus of evaluation, the authority lives outside you. Other people, cultural standards, expert opinions, social media reactions, these determine whether your experience is valid. You're constantly checking, is this right? Is this enough? Am I doing this correctly? With an internal locus of evaluation, the authority lives within you. You trust your own organismic experience as the primary source of truth. You can still consider external perspectives, but they're input, not commandments. Most of us start life with an internal locus. Watch a toddler. They know what they like with absolute certainty. They don't care if it's cool or impressive. They don't worry about trends. They just know, I like this. I don't like that. But remember those conditions of worth? Each one shifts the locus of evaluation a bit more external. You shouldn't like that. That's not appropriate. People like us don't do that. What will others think? By adulthood, many of us have almost entirely externalized our locus of evaluation. We've lost the ability to trust our own experience. A woman in Oxford finishes reading a highly acclaimed novel. It's won prizes. Everyone says it's brilliant. But she didn't enjoy it. She found it tedious. With an external locus of evaluation, she thinks, what's wrong with me? Why don't I appreciate this? I must not be sophisticated enough. I must be missing something. With an internal locus, she thinks, interesting. This doesn't resonate with me, even though others love it. That's useful information about my preferences. The difference seems small, but multiply it across hundreds of decisions, what to study, where to live, whom to date, how to spend your time, and the cumulative effect is massive. Here's why this matters for joy. Joy requires authenticity. It requires actually connecting with your own experience rather than the experience you think you should be having. You can't feel genuine joy in a job if you're constantly worried about whether it's prestigious enough. You can't feel joy in a relationship if you're focused on whether it looks good to others. You can't feel joy in a hobby if you're concerned about whether it's productive or impressive. Rogers put it simply, the good life is a process, not a state of being. It is a direction, not a destination. That direction is inward, toward trusting your own organismic experience. A young man in Leeds is scrolling through social media. Everyone seems to be traveling, achieving, living their best lives. He feels inadequate. He's a teacher, stable, but not exciting. He enjoys quiet weekends, reading, cooking. But his external locus of evaluation tells him this isn't enough. He should be doing more, being more, achieving more. What he can't see, many of those people posting their achievements are just as joyless as he is. They're performing for the same external evaluation he's submitted himself to. They've achieved the markers of success while losing themselves in the process. An external locus of evaluation inevitably leads to comparison. And comparison is joy's enemy. Not because others' achievements diminish yours, but because comparison keeps you outside your own experience. You're at a concert, but you're thinking about whether you're at the right concert, whether you should be somewhere cooler, whether this choice reflects well on you. You're at dinner, but you're wondering if you ordered the right thing, if you're eating at the right restaurant. You're on holiday, but you're curating it for social media rather than experiencing it. Rogers saw this clearly. The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. But here's the question that might be forming: in a world that absolutely demands external performance, jobs, relationships, social standing all depend on meeting external standards, isn't an internal locus of evaluation impractical? Naive? Rogers had a sophisticated answer to this objection, and it reveals something profound about what it means to be fully human. Unconditional positive regard. There's a common misunderstanding of Rogers' ideas. People hears internal locus of evaluation or be yourself and think he's advocating narcissism or social irresponsibility. If everyone just did whatever they felt like, wouldn't society collapse? But Roger's answer was nuanced. He'd observed something remarkable in his therapeutic work. When people received a specific kind of relational environment, they naturally moved toward both greater authenticity and greater social responsibility. Not either or, but both and. The key was what he called unconditional positive regard. Unconditional positive regard means being valued as a human being without conditions attached. Not I value you when you're successful, or I accept you if you agree with me. Just I value you. Period. In Roger's therapy sessions, this was revolutionary. Clients walked in expecting judgment, analysis, diagnosis. Instead, Rogers offered something else: complete acceptance. Not approval of everything they did, but acceptance of them as whole persons worthy of respect and understanding. Rogers noticed a pattern. When clients experienced unconditional positive regard, sometimes for the first time in their lives, something shifted. The defensiveness decreased. The performance dropped away. They could finally admit things they'd hidden from themselves. I hate my career. I don't want children. I'm exhausted pretending to be strong. And here's what surprised people: when clients became more honest about who they really were, they didn't become more selfish. Often, they became more genuinely considerate. Because when you're not fighting to maintain a false self, you have actual energy and attention for others. A woman in her 50s sits in Roger's office in Wisconsin. She's spent decades being the perfect wife, perfect mother, perfect colleague. She's helped everyone, sacrificed constantly, never complained. From the outside, she's admirable. But inside, she's furious, resentful, exhausted, and deeply ashamed of feeling this way. Rogers doesn't reassure her that she shouldn't feel resentful. He doesn't tell her to be grateful for what she has. He simply accepts that this is her current experience. You're carrying a lot of anger, he reflects. The relief in the room is palpable. For once, she doesn't have to perform. For once, she can just be what she is, even the ugly parts. What happens next defies expectations. Once she's allowed to fully acknowledge her resentment without judgment, it starts to shift. Not because she's been convinced to suppress it, but because she's finally in authentic contact with herself. She realizes she's been saying yes to things she doesn't want, then resenting people for accepting her yes. She's been performing helpfulness to meet conditions of worth while her organismic self has been screaming enough. Roger's unconditional regard created space for her to hear that internal voice again. And once she could hear it, she could make different choices, not from resentment or rebellion, but from genuine alignment. But here's the problem: Rogers isn't in your life. You didn't have the luxury of his therapeutic presence. And most of us haven't received consistent unconditional positive regard, especially not in childhood when it matters most. So what now? Rogers' later work explored this question. He realized, while it's profoundly helpful to receive unconditional positive regard from others, it's also possible, necessary, even, to develop it toward yourself. This isn't about approval. You don't have to approve of everything you think, feel, or do. But you can accept that these are your genuine responses. You can treat yourself with the same quality of attention Rogers offered his clients: curious, non-judgmental, respectful. I notice I feel resentful in this situation. That's interesting information, not a moral failing. I notice I don't enjoy this thing I'm supposed to enjoy. That's valuable data about who I am. I notice I want something different from what I've built. That's worth listening to. Rogers discovered a paradox that's now supported by decades of psychological research: acceptance is the prerequisite for authentic change. When you're constantly judging and trying to fix yourself, you're operating from the self-concept, that constructed self based on conditions of worth. You're trying to force yourself into a predetermined shape. But when you accept yourself as you actually are, including the messy, inconvenient parts, you create space for the organismic self to emerge. You create conditions for the actualizing tendency to operate. Remember that woman at the art gallery with the internal locus of evaluation? Her ability to trust her own responses came from somewhere. It came from some foundational sense that her experience is valid, that she doesn't have to justify her authentic responses. That's what unconditional positive regard, from others or from yourself, provides. Permission to be real. And only from that realness can joy emerge. You can't feel joy while simultaneously judging yourself for how you feel. I should be happier. I should be grateful. I shouldn't feel this way. Each should create distance from your actual experience. Each judgment reinforces the split. So we're starting to see the architecture of the problem. Conditions of worth created a split between your true self and your self-concept. You lost touch with your organismic valuing process. Your locus of evaluation moved external. And without unconditional positive regard from others or yourself, maintaining the performance became exhausting. But Rogers didn't leave us there. His most important contribution wasn't just diagnosing the problem. It was describing what it looks like to move back toward wholeness, toward what he called the fully functioning person. And that description might change how you think about what you're actually after. The fully functioning person. Rogers spent years observing clients who'd gone through successful therapy, people who'd moved from incongruence toward authenticity. He noticed common patterns in how they engaged with life. From these observations, he developed his concept of the fully functioning person. This isn't a destination. It's not something you achieve and then maintain. It's a direction of movement, a way of being in the world. The fully functioning person is open to experience, all of it. Not just the pleasant or acceptable feelings, but the full spectrum of human emotion. They don't filter their experience through conditions of worth. They don't immediately jump to "I shouldn't feel this way." They simply notice, "This is what I'm experiencing right now." A man in Birmingham loses his job. His immediate feeling is relief, which surprises him, even scares him. Shouldn't he feel devastated? Shouldn't he be worried? With openness to experience, he doesn't override that relief. He gets curious about it. What is this relief telling me? What was I relieved to be freed from? The answer emerges: he hated that job. He'd been performing competence while feeling dead inside. The relief is his organismic self recognizing, we're no longer in that depleting environment. This doesn't mean he ignores practical concerns. But he starts from truth rather than should. And from that truth, he can make clearer decisions about what's next. Rogers described the fully functioning person as living existentially, fully in the present moment rather than rigid patterns from the past or anxieties about the future. This doesn't mean ignoring consequences or living recklessly. It means each moment is fresh, genuinely encountered rather than filtered through fixed interpretations. Two people attend the same dinner party in Cornwall. One is constantly comparing it to previous parties, worrying about how they're being perceived, rehearsing what to say next. They're present physically but absent experientially. The other is genuinely there. They notice the candlelight, the quality of someone's laugh, the interesting tangent in a conversation. They're not performing presence, they're actually present. The first person leaves exhausted, unable to remember much of it. The second leaves energized, genuinely connected. The fully functioning person trusts their organismic valuing process. They've developed confidence that their spontaneous feelings and reactions, while not infallible, are trustworthy guides. This is perhaps the most challenging characteristic to develop because it requires unlearning years of self-distrust. A woman in Glasgow is considering a job offer. On paper, it's perfect: more money, better title, impressive company. But something feels off. She can't articulate why. It's just a vague unease. The old pattern would be to override that feeling: "Don't be stupid. This is a great opportunity. You're just being fearful." But she's been working on organismic trusting. She sits with the unease. She doesn't force a decision. And gradually, clarity emerges. The company culture reminds her of a previous toxic environment. Her organism recognized something her conscious mind hadn't yet processed. She declines the offer. 6 months later, she learns the company is under investigation for hostile work practices. Her organismic sense was right. Rogers emphasized that the fully functioning person experiences freedom, not the absence of constraints, but the sense that choices emerge from within rather than being imposed from without. You might still do many of the same things. But there's a difference between I have to do this and I choose to do this, even though it's difficult. A man is caring for his elderly father in Newcastle. It's demanding, exhausting, sometimes frustrating. An acquaintance says, "You must feel so trapped." But he doesn't. Yes, it's hard. Yes, there are easier paths. But this choice aligns with his values, with who he genuinely wants to be. He's not performing duty. He's living according to his authentic values. That's experimental freedom, the sense that your life is authored from within. Rogers observed that fully functioning people tend to be creative, not necessarily artistically, but in their approach to life. They're less bound by convention. They can see novel solutions. They're willing to experiment. Because when you're not exhausted maintaining a false self, when you're not constantly monitoring for approval, creativity emerges naturally. The actualizing tendency is inherently creative. And here's where joy returns. Not as something pursued or manufactured, but as a natural byproduct of congruence. When you're open to experience, living existentially, trusting your organism, feeling free, engaging creatively, joy emerges spontaneously. Not constant euphoria, but aliveness. Engagement. The felt sense that your life is yours, that you're inhabiting it rather than performing it. A walk in the park becomes genuinely pleasant instead of a box to check. A conversation becomes engaging instead of an anxiety performance. Work, even when challenging, can feel meaningful when it aligns with your actual values. Here's Rogers' final paradox: the fully functioning person doesn't pursue happiness. They pursue congruence, authenticity, growth. And happiness, genuine joy, emerges as a byproduct. The person chasing happiness according to external standards exhausts themselves and remains joyless. The person pursuing genuine alignment with their organismic self finds that joy was there all along, waiting to be uncovered. Rogers was clear: this isn't a permanent state. The fully functioning person isn't perfectly congruent all the time. They still experience doubt, confusion, pain. Life still contains genuine suffering. But there's a quality difference. The suffering that comes from living authentically is clean pain, difficult but meaningful. The suffering that comes from incongruence is dirty pain, suffering about suffering, the exhaustion of constant self-betrayal. This all sounds beautiful in theory. But you might be thinking, how? How do I actually move from where I am now, disconnected, joyless, toward this fully functioning way of being? Is it even possible without Rogers as my therapist? The answer is yes. But it requires a specific kind of work, and that work might look different from what you expect. The path back to yourself. Let's be honest about something: if you've spent years, maybe decades, living according to conditions of worth, reconnecting with your organismic self isn't a weekend project. The patterns are deep. The self-distrust is real. The fear of what authenticity might require can be overwhelming. Rogers understood this. He never promised easy transformation. But he did identify specific practices that create conditions for change. The first step is simply noticing. You can't change patterns you're unaware of. Start paying attention to the gap between your genuine responses and your performed responses. Not to judge yourself, but simply to notice. I said I wanted to go to that event, but my body tightened when I agreed. What was that about? I posted about being excited for this promotion, but I felt hollow writing it. What's the truth? I laughed at that joke, but I actually found it offensive. Why did I pretend? Rogers sometimes encouraged clients to check in with themselves regularly. What am I experiencing right now? Not what should I be experiencing, but what is actually here. A woman in Liverpool starts a simple practice. 3 times a day, she pauses and asks herself, how am I actually feeling? What do I genuinely want right now? The first few weeks, the answers are murky. She's lost touch with her internal signals. But gradually, the voice gets clearer. I'm exhausted. I'm lonely. I'm angry. I actually don't want to do this. These aren't comfortable revelations. But they're true. And truth is the starting point. You don't have to overhaul your entire life immediately. In fact, that's usually counterproductive. Start small.